should probably mention that we've got these wonderful organizations in Canada, Greenpeace last night, Environmental Defense, and IISD here, and we need to support them. And I know that Greenpeace doesn't have a charitable number because they're doing very important work, and they still do need your support. They're involved in various kinds of litigation that we really need them to do. We need to support the wonderful work that you heard about today, because exploring those contradictions is not easy work. It's hard work. We do need to support them all in doing that work, and particularly since in Canada it is even more contentious. This same Forbes survey I was mentioning before says that globally, climate deniers make up only 4% of the global population. 4%. Compared to what we're hearing here in Canada. We need to be active in the conversation.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, we have a rapporteur team working really hard, including three students, please raise your hands, who are helping us to compile key insights and recommendations we're going to take away from this conference. And out of this, we will distill a report, but particularly focus on maybe half a dozen or so recommendations that we'd like to take to governments at all levels and to civil society. So I just wanted to say that by way of telling you where we're going after this conference. Now, in terms of the panel, I'm so glad that Dale brought up the issue of adaptation and adaptation challenges, because really climate change is like a two-front war. There's mitigation and there's adaptation, but adaptation is the lost child, right? It's the bottom of the list, and a large part of the reason for that is the brunt of adaptation costs is borne by the poorest countries and people, and the vast majority of deaths that occur are in developing countries. So they kind of fall off the list, and my concern is that particularly now that tornadoes are visiting us closer to home, that we will start to think of adaptation as what we do at home when we should do it universally. So Susan's point, and this goes back to our recommendations of, instead of spending $4.5 billion on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, why don't we put that into our aid budget and make that our contribution to our adaptation goals and commitments? Because the other side of this is that Canada's aid performance is really quite pathetic. You know, our aid to GDP, GNI ratio is the lowest it's been in about 20 years, and the only few countries that are lower than us are the United States. So even if we add another $4 billion to our ODA, we will still be far below the leaders like the Scandinavians and the Germans and the French. So there's a lot of scope for action there, but I'd appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Roy. I think we'll take a few questions. If it's all right if you take a few notes so that we can do a few questions in a row. Is that all right? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, Jerry Schmitz. There's a term that has not been mentioned yet this morning, but is very much part of the polarized debate in Canada, and that is social license, which is sort of, we can have our cake and eat it too. This is very much promoted by the Alberta and the federal governments and others. This kind of economy, climate change bargain, whereby we can both expand oil and gas development and we can tackle climate change at the same time. And that basically, I think, is the position of both the Alberta and the federal governments. So I would like both of the panelists to sort of comment on this. Perhaps it's a contradiction in terms, but it is being thrown around, and I think it needs to be tackled.
It's Derek Paul and Coalition Climat Montréal. You mentioned, Dr. Vaughan, that there's an exponential growth of the renewables, and I remember in the first decade of this century that the exponential rate of growth of photovoltaic was much higher than that of wind, but they were both very high. And I'd be interested to know if you have separate figures on these and what they are. I also want, if I can do it politely, to correct your datum about the photovoltaic being the biggest provider of renewable energy in China. I did a study of this a year and a half ago, and hydropower projected to, and photovoltaics projected to the year 2020, hydropower is 7 times in production, not in installed capacity, that's a different thing, but in production it's much highest, and wind perhaps 25% higher, but all these things depend on whether the sun shines and whether the wind blows.
Thank you, Derek. There was one person, right? Yeah.
I'm Tracy Man with Climate Wise Women, and I'm going to use this opportunity to set up my lunchtime talk. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Scott. But Dale, in particular, I wanted to ask you, with so much field experience, can you speak a little bit to this group? And as I said, help me set up my talk for this afternoon by speaking about the impacts of climate change that you've seen in these grassroots communities on women particularly, and some of the solutions you've also seen them leading on in those communities.
Thank you. And there's one.
Yes, George Jacoby, I'd just like to follow up Jerry's question by asking you whether you have any recommendations for platforms and policies within political parties. And I'm just wondering whether the sort of balanced approach that the federal government, social license, whatever you want to call it, trying to achieve both objectives at the same time of the federal government and the Alberta government are likely to be winning strategies in the next election, given that we've seen a massive setback to green energy in the province of Ontario. And if a Conservative government was elected in either federally or Alberta, you would probably see the same results. But can a mixed sort of policy like that continue to win in these circumstances?
Thank you. There's one person just behind you there. I don't know. Could you identify yourself?
Hi, I'm Nick Filonino. I'm with a larger group from St. Lawrence University, New York. My question was for Dale Marshall about, you talked about making, on the scale of local government, making the switch to clean energies make sense for these communities. For people working to impact local communities, what is a way to incentivize the switch and make it not only painless, but actually a viable option, and just speak to these issues?
Thank you, Nick. Angela.
Angela Keller-Herzog here from Ottawa. My question is for Dale. I think that all of us have seen some seriously senior people, and I mean age-wise senior, arrested at the park protesting Kinder Morgan. Dale, you basically told us that you believe that government will step in and will step up and will take responsibility and will offer the solutions to us in Canada. I think that's hugely optimistic. And you did say something about engaged citizens. And I'm wondering whether you, in your heart of heart, think that government will step up, or if we do actually need the broad-based civil disobedience and broad-based civil action that Naomi Klein calls for. And I think it's very appropriate to discuss this in a room with some seriously senior people, because to some degree, once our kids are out of the house and once we're retired, we do have the freedom to get arrested.
Thank you, Angela. Now we've neglected.
Hi, Paul Beckwith. I have a really serious problem with this idea of just transition. You know, like a third or half, many Canadians live paycheck to paycheck. We have oil sands workers who have made 100,000. The average wage is probably 140,000. They've been doing it for 10 years. And we have to actually worry about them transitioning to another job. I think it's absurd. I think it's, this is more propaganda from the oil industry that they want their own to be, carrying on with these jobs. What about the NGOs, for example, that fight, for climate change and communication of climate? They get no money. Right? They're scratching on donations. you know, I've done hundreds and hundreds of videos. I rely just on donations for my work, right? Universities are specialized. They're not looking at the big picture. There's no funding. You know, if you're a scientist, you have to specialize. You can't fight climate change. You can't go up and talk. There's incentives not to because you're attacked, and there's no money for going and communicating to the public. So the idea of feeling sorry for oil sands workers when, like, Nortel was completely ignored, for example. What about all those people that got laid off? So it's time for the community here to oppose this idea. You know, just transition is an absurd concept for people that have been making huge salaries for many years. Thank you.
My name's Camila. I'm one of the student rapporteurs, but I'm studying my MA in International Development. So my question is for Dale. What would you say to the issue that exists with a lot of developing countries who don't want to kind of do that, go into alternative energy so quickly, and they see themselves being forced into it by these developed countries who have really caused the problem when developing countries haven't, and now they're being forced to jump over their own development?
Louis Ramirez. I'm with the Rapid Decarbonization Group. We've heard a lot about innovation and technologies, renewables, etc. But I was wondering if either of you could address the elephant in the renewable room, which is the energy storage, right? Which, while photovoltaics have been exploding, storage has not been doing so well. And so, do you think that this limits the potential for innovation to tackle the climate crisis, or can it be sidelined?
I think the just transition is not something that's been cooked up by the oil and gas sector in Canada. I mentioned it came out of the International Labour Organization. We've been working in China, in one province of China, on how to think about the dislocation of 250,000 workers because of China's move away from coal. And those workers are not making $100,000 a year. And when you think about Nigeria, you think about Papua New Guinea, et cetera, it's not, I'm not staying up at night worrying about the $100,000 driver in Fort McMurray. So I think this has come out of the ILO, and ILO is very rigorous about things like core labor standards, human rights, et cetera. I think you're quite right on renewables. I didn't include hydro. I think that the best place for getting the latest data is called the International Renewable Energy Agency. It's out of Abu Dhabi. I think right now the investments in solar have outstripped wind by about 4 to 1. And they just had latest 2018 data. I think on hydro, there's a longer, you could have maybe next year, Susan, you could have the session on hydro. Among the things that ISD does, we run something called the Experimental Lakes Area, which was going to be closed down a couple of years ago with the previous government, and we run it, and we had a session last week with David Schindler, and I think Dr. Schindler said that, you know, it's the data says that hydro is not climate free. The methane and other emissions, because of large hydro power, is actually a net contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's better than coal, but it's still a climate issue. I know most of the questions around adaptation were for Dale. I just want to mention among the things that ISD, so we work in at any given day about 80 countries. We have, we work around the world. Most of our work is outside of Canada. But among the things we do run is a global network called the National Adaptation Planning Network. It's now involving 100 different countries, mostly low-income developing countries. And it's quite right just to say the most exposed communities and households to climate impacts are in low-income countries. And so there's areas where we're seeing really innovative work at the farm level, for example, in Uganda and Kenya and Vietnam and Cambodia. But the financing of the $100 billion that have been promised in Paris, of that $100 billion, about 5 is towards adaptation. And so, and you're seeing what's happening here in Ottawa. You just magnify that by what's happening almost daily because of prolonged droughts, et cetera. So the last thing I'm not going to mention, but what I wanted to talk about with this question of pollution, and just to say, we have an office in Beijing, and the single indicator that people look at every single morning is PM 2.5. What's the level of pollution in Beijing, and how does that level compare to the World Health Organization's allowable safe levels? And I think the Chinese government is rightfully concerned about 2 things. So one is the U.S. Embassy, I don't know what they still do with the Trump era, but the U.S. Embassy would give their daily readings of air pollution levels, and then that would differ by an order of magnitude from the official ranking by several factors. You know, sometimes it would be off by, 300-400%. And when you think about that, then you think that, I think the Chinese government was worried about, well, can they believe any of our data? And what does it say about official data as opposed to other data coming in around what the level of risk is? And cancer rates in Beijing and Shanghai are significantly higher because of exposure to pollution. WHO says 6 million people die every year because of exposure to air and water pollution. So I think the pollution issue is part of climate issues, and black carbon would be a perfect example of that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
How long do I have, Susan? It's a lot here. 10
minutes? 15?
Oh, okay. I won't take that long. On adaptation, yes. There is a big role for the private sector to play in mitigation. Adaptation, not so much. And so we need governments to come forward with that adaptation money. You can leverage private sector money through incentivizing stuff, incentivizing the kinds of energy development we want, the kinds of efficiency investments we want. Adaptation does not have that profit motive, and so we need governments to be stepping up to fill that void. And the fact that the roadmap that's been developed already is so mitigation heavy, and Canada's contribution to that is so mitigation heavy, is really problematic. In terms of social license, I mean, the reality is that if good energy project proposals came forward, they would get social license. True social license isn't, we're going to keep moving forward on this path and pretend that we can do both energy development in fossil fuels and deal with climate change. But if there in fact were policies in place that would ensure that the projects that were being proposed and considered were projects that communities liked and that can benefit from it, then that would happen. You look at I don't know how to say it, but the energy transition that happened in Germany, right? Policies were created so that there was local benefits. Local people, co-ops could invest in renewable energy, and they did, because they wanted energy development, they wanted economic development, but not through things that would increase their risks or their pollution. Yeah, I mean, I could talk for a long time about the impacts and adaptation measures that I have seen. Let me just dabble with a bit. So Anote's arc was about sea level rise and what that means for low-lying countries. So I spent time in the southern part of Bangladesh, and they were facing the same thing, of course. Bangladesh, 150 million people in the size of the maritime provinces. And sea level rise is inundating their soils. Salt intrusion is happening there. They have trouble accessing fresh water and growing crops. Myanmar was a place that was hit by Typhoon Nargis. I think it was 2005, and the people who are there talk about their lives in pre-Nargis and post-Nargis terms, because it's so fundamentally changed their way of life and their vulnerability. In Kenya, the Maasai, who were traditionally nomadic, would take their cattle out on the land. It was so dry for so long that there were no longer watering holes that they could bring their cattle to drink or to feed. And in most cases, the adaptation measures, I could talk about what the adaptation measures are, but the way that you deal with that is by working with communities. Community-based adaptation is absolutely what's necessary. There was a time in development, and including in adaptation, where experts would come in and say, this is what you need, right? We've got the solution for you. And the model, I think, has changed, and it needs to continue to change, but the model now is about community-based participatory. People going in who have resources and saying, what are your vulnerabilities? What are your resources? Can we think together about what's possible and what solutions make sense for you? You know, in just as an example, in the case of Bangladesh, the dikes were built like a long 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it turns out that what they did is they actually held in the salt water when those got breached. So it was like an example of maladaptation. And yet, if we had gone in and I say gone in, but like if we brought resources and worked with communities, we can come up with solutions that make sense for them and that they can move forward on. In terms of, yeah, I mean, the reality of Canadian politics is that it's really hard for parties to talk about phasing out fossil fuels. In the last election, Linda McQuaig talked about phasing out fossil fuels and got immediately slammed, and her party immediately retracted on that. So, you know, I recognize the challenge of politics. I also recognize that increasingly we are seeing politicians who are coming forward with unpopular notions that 10 years ago, oh, you would never have a politician say that, both on the left and the right. And because of the demographics in Canada, because of the youth that are coming through, because of, for example, what happened, there was quite a large segment of young people who, and progressives who voted for Trudeau in the last election and who now are possibly rethinking that. I think there's space for there to be a political party and political parties to actually put forward bold ideas that don't continue this lie that we can increase fossil fuels and deal with climate change. In my heart of hearts, I think we're going to win. But that's not because governments are going to act on their own. I feel like we should turn off the cameras while I say that civil disobedience is going to be part of the solution. We're going to need we're going to need to mobilize in ways that we haven't before to deal with this. Governments will move, but it will be because we demand it of them and because there are people getting arrested, as well as people who are playing other roles, research, education, advocacy, policy development. But none of that happens without a mobilized constituency of people who care and who are willing to fight. I respect your view on just transition. I get it. I do think, though, that in Canada, we need to make sure that we have a social safety net for all. And what a Just Transition program is primarily, from the workers' perspective, is training. And so we don't, when somebody loses their job, we don't say, was it a really high-paying job? Because it's only if it was a low-paying job that we'll give you EI. No, we have a social safety net for everybody. And when it's government policy that is the one that disrupts a community, a worker, an industry, we need to also have a social safety net there as well. And I think we can design one in a way that makes sense so that people aren't just left by themselves to figure out what they're going to do next. In terms of developing countries versus industrialized countries, I mean, this has been the conundrum at the UNFCCC for a long time. What kinds of commitments do the developing countries have to take on versus industrialized countries? And from the start, from the original framework convention, there was this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, that we all needed to act. Developing countries had to act as well, but they had to act in different ways. And so is there some energy development that's going to happen in the developing world that is about, India has literally hundreds of millions of people that can't turn on a light bulb. Should they be allowed to pursue energy development? Yes. but there's also a role there in the financing issue of developing countries under Paris have taken on, have put forward nationally determined contributions. And some of them are, we're going to do these things by ourselves. And if we have financing, we can do these other things. And so if industrialized countries like Canada come forward and say to whatever country, India is a fine example, you want to build a coal-fired power plant, how about if we come with money and we decide instead to build a solar array for in this place, in this place, in this place. So there's a role there for so-called matchboxing, financing from the industrialized world and energy development in the developing world, so that they do pursue low carbon development. Pollution is one of the. We increasingly use the notion of carbon pollution. We're increasingly talking about health impacts because we know that, in fact, that does resonate with people. It doesn't. We're also going to keep talking about climate change because it's a dire issue, and I think it's a moral issue, and I think people get the notion of polluter pays. Talk about polluter pays in the context of climate change. But yeah, the research is clear that people do care about local air pollution more than they care about climate change. So one last thing, carbon pricing. It's true. The problem with carbon pricing is that it's true. If you got to a certain level, you'd get a lot of action from all over the place. But the problem is getting to that level. And carbon pricing is, so the way that I think about it is that carbon pricing is an essential element of climate action, but it's only one tool. Like, why not undertake regulatory measures? Ontario's coal-fired power plants were shut down because of regulations. What the carbon price that would have been required to shut them down because of the carbon price would be so high it's politically unpalatable. But a government did it by regulations. We can't forget that that is another tool. So carbon pricing has its place, but it's not the only thing. You talked about local development of renewable energy, and there are policies that can help with that in all kinds of places, right? At the provincial level, feed-in tariffs that allow for people to install solar power on their roofs, support for things like OREC here in Ottawa, support for energy co-ops that are undertaking a lot of these investments. Financing is a big issue, and so if local municipalities can figure out a way for people to pay for renewable energy, like solar power on their roof, through a deduction on their power bill over time, that allows for that initial. The problem with solar is it's got a big initial investment, and then it doesn't cost much. So if you figure out the financing piece, you can figure out how to get those investments made. But it requires utilities working with local governments, working with people who want to do it. There are people who know a lot more about this than I do. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For this afternoon, I want to just let you know how some of what we've just heard links to what we're going to be hearing this afternoon. As you've heard, Tracy Man will be speaking as soon as you get your lunch together and bring it back in, we hope, by 12:45. After Tracy, I think we didn't hear much about the women impact on women, but I think I'll say that it's. You want to say something? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Horrible. Sorry. Yeah. This is the reality of climate change, is that it does affect women much more, women and children much more than men. Women are much less able to migrate. They're much more willing to be the ones who are taking care of health impacts, and the solutions again are to make sure when you go into communities that you talk to the men, and you talk to the women, and you talk to the boys, and you talk to the girls, and you find out what are your vulnerabilities, what are your problems, how can we solve them. So it's again about a bottom-up approach to coming up with solutions, but it's absolutely so vital that a gender lens is put to all the work that happens on adaptation. So I'm sorry for not saying that.
Sorry to embarrass you there, Dale. I was going to say that that women, generally speaking, are more worried about their food and their health of the family. And on the health issue, in relation to mobilization, we've heard talk about mobilization, and we're going to need to talk more of it for a couple reasons. One is I was privileged to chair a global 3-day conversation on disaster mitigation and management. And what came up there was that what helps you is your neighbor. In a problem, what helps you is your community. And resilient communities is the essence of what we have to be developing internationally and nationally for disaster plans. And those kinds of community building serve both of our goals at this conference. So it's really important that we get there. In the afternoon panel, Andrea Harden Donahue will be talking from the Council of Canadians, lots of experience with mobilizing. And Martin Settle from the Unitarian Service Committee, the USC, will be talking once again about global agriculture, and I'm sure he'll be talking about women in regard to that as well. Dale mentioned we need a climate test. Karine Peloffy will be talking about exactly that, a climate test. And we've noticed that it required a lot of people on the street for women's issues and for slavery issues. We didn't have so many on the street for tobacco, but we still got to change. I think that maybe the topic of health that we've touched on here, I think that's something we really need to explore more. And you're going to be hearing this afternoon from Dr. Curtis Lavoie of the Public Health Agency about health. So, bon appetit. Thank you very much.